Welcome, everyone, to today's NTC Now session. I'm Paige. I lead the community at the Nature Tech Collective. Um, and we're essentially a global community of innovators. We're committed organizations that are measuring, restoring, or funding the restoration of nature. Our overarching mission is to accelerate a nature-positive future by fostering collaboration, by sharing knowledge, by amplifying impact across the entire nature tech ecosystem. And today, specifically, we're exploring a multi-year partnership between Agerpoint and a major global corporation that's working to address one of agriculture's most pressing challenges, which is the intersection of climate change, commodity supply chains, and landscape stewardship. Um, as we probably all know here, I'm preaching to the choir, right? The agricultural sector is kind of sitting at a really critical juncture. Climate-driven disease proliferation is decimating traditional growing regions, and so commodity prices for things like coffee and cocoa are experiencing massive volatility, and corporations downstreams in value chains are recognizing that they have to take responsibility for stewarding those landscapes that feed their operations. But the data that's needed to monitor productivity and detect disease really early or forecast supply chain remains really difficult to collect at scale, especially across different geographies with varying levels of technical infrastructure and expertise, right? So to that effect, I'm really happy to have Nick here from Agerpoint, whose, startup is basically tackling just that. Agerpoint, I'll let you describe actually. And yeah, without further ado, Nick, please can you tell us more, first of all, about who you are and what Agerpoint does?
Yeah, thank you for that intro page. Thanks everyone for being here today. This is such a fantastic community. I really appreciate everyone who's here trying to make an impact in the nature space, and the agricultural world, I think, is very much tied to that. I work for Agerpoint. We're a AI and data company that is focused on helping to get better results and better data out of the field to allow for improved decision making for program managers, anybody who deals with the land use sector. And we bring a suite of tools to help make that happen, to allow for this multimodal data capture and data fusion. My personal origin story is a little bit less of the agriculture space and more around the nature side. I actually worked for a carbon project developer that was based in East Africa, and so got to experience some of the real ways in which climate change is affecting people on the ground, particularly in the equatorial belts where there's a lot of devastating impacts. But also in agroforestry context, to see how people are being very resilient and using agriculture as a way to kind of combat some of the stuff that we're facing. And then on the other half is as part of this project developer, understanding what is expected of these programs, people that deal with the land use sector, and the level of data that is necessary, but oftentimes is overlooked in the program design and project planning. And so I think having that as my background has really helped me understand how technology can be used in real ways. And oftentimes, sometimes in the tech space, we get confused between technology as the end goal, but really it's just a means to an end. So making sure that we're applying it to real world contexts and solving real problems for real people. And that's what Agerpoint's mission is.
Well, amen to that. Um, okay, yeah, thumbs up. Uh, well, let's start at the very, very beginning of this story. At the origin, Agerpoint is starting in kind of like a research and development context. Can you tell us what you were developing way back then? How was it, like 5 years ago?
Yeah, Agerpoint's origin story actually spans more closer to 10 years ago, way before my time actually at the company. But we have a lot of folks on our team who come from these backgrounds, right? For production, agriculture, research and development, agronomists, folks that are in the nature conservation space. Um, and I think one of the things we observed is, as we're trying to take things out of the lab and into the field, there's sometimes a difference and a disconnect between the two. So in R&D context, you have very controlled environments that are very easy to regulate and manage and monitor. But when you take that out of the lab, it can sometimes feel like the Wild West. And so there's all these great solutions and these ideas about how to improve management practices, how to optimize species and optimize yield of your produce, or manage diseases and find these varietals that oftentimes is uh, not accounted for. And so what Agerpoint's mission was is to bridge that gap between how these ideas, like I said, get out of the lab and into the field and taken into production environments. And a lot of the ways in which we need to bring that level of precision and data is what Agerpoint's working to solve. So we've worked in research contexts anywhere from permanent crops to row crops, cocoa to corn, testing our technology first in contexts like greenhouses, making sure that it's applicable and works, and then replicating those trials from greenhouses and taking them into production. So practically, there's a level of precision, I think, in data that needs to be collected about the morphology of plants, the structures of them, the health, and maybe a sense of, in the agriculture context, the yield and the productivity. But how do
And
we
maybe
get that precision into the field? We need, technology to help us with that.
absolutely. And at that point, from what I remember you telling me, is you were trying to create 3D models to extract information around plant health, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you think about what is done in research contexts that is needed in production is, oftentimes you're measuring plants, right? You're getting some sense of, like I said, that physical morphology, the visible indicators. Oftentimes those things require experts in the field. They're maybe tedious to do. Plants aren't as simple to measure as, a desk in your apartment. There's a lot of nuances to how you have to do these measurements, and so it requires the expertise that is achievable in R&D context, but maybe not so much when you're dealing in a remote location where you're growing these crops. But that information is super vital and very necessary in order to actually ensure that what you're doing is actually making an impact, whether you're doing like a regenerative agriculture practice or just trying to get a sense of the health of your field to make a decision about when to deploy labor to go harvest. All of that requires a lot of physical measurements and physical interaction with the world. And so
Mhm.
our idea was, okay, how can we make that more accessible, more affordable, allowing for anybody to be that data collector and get that insight without the need for complex hardware, um, and ultimately allow for maybe someone who's less skilled or perhaps has different skills than an agronomist would, be that local node in these remote regions in which agriculture oftentimes exists.
Really interesting. And I've just downloaded Plant Snap to try and figure out what's wrong with my own plants here. So I have uh, vague kind of interaction with technologies like yours.
Yeah.
But the reason why it's becoming so important right now, and where this partnership as well that we're going to talk about is starting, is that about 2 years ago, the commodity market started facing massive pressure. And there were real spikes linked to disease proliferation and climate worsening. So that's kind of the starting point for what we're talking about here. This global corporation, which I'm going to ask you to kind of speak for, what are they facing, and what decisions are they starting to make essentially?
Yeah, absolutely. So about 2 to 3 years ago, and this is a problem that's pervaded across many years, but I think it really hit the cocoa value chain particularly hard a few years ago, where this prevalence of disease just decimated a large bulk of the supply of cacao in parts of West Africa and really throughout the world. Um, what you saw was a massive increase in the prices of cocoa. I think 130% price increases of a commodity that we take for granted in many of our inputs. Chocolate bars, candies, flavors. Cocoa exists in, is what we perceive as a staple to our food supply. But when you don't have kind of these resilient supply chains, or you have the effects of climate change become worse, you start to see a little bit of variability in the crop that's produced, and ultimately, companies and consumers as well as the farmers that grow it, suffer the consequences. So one of these companies that we were working with, they recognized, I think, the need for better data about how their cocoa value chains were operating. They weren't necessarily maybe integrated into the vertically integrated where they're owning their own farms, but there's so many downstream reliance on the producers of agriculture that ultimately need to have a better sense, whether that's a food and bev company or commodities traders or anybody that relies on these inputs or outputs from the land as inputs for their for their ultimate finished goods. They need to understand how are these value chains operating? How are they performing? Where is the cacao coming from? Is there a potential indicators of disease that they can get ahead of early to perhaps diversify their sourcing and procurement? These are all important business decisions that ultimately affect the company, but they also have real implications for the people that touch the land directly.
Nice. And yes. And so you're saying that this global corporation that we're not naming, they started integrating vertically, and once they had a production scaled to production farms, what were some of the pain points that they were seeing basically and they started trying to collect data, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The data, I think, is the real bridge between trying to get a sense of the problem and actually making a decision, and that has a real impact. Um, so concretely, you know, in this disease instance, if there's ways that we could get ahead of early detection of these disease or start mapping the spread of disease from one area to the other, almost think about the like with COVID, like contact tracing, where you're starting to map instances of these across large areas. You can see where you can maybe insulate one area from the rest of the disease, or maybe if you can detect the patterns of spread, you might be able to intervene early enough so you don't actually, so the rest of the produce isn't affected, or the rest of the crops don't get affected. Um, it's a it, Unfortunately, plants don't speak to us like people speak to us, or even animals, right? It's like we have to we make decisions and we kind of just trust that these things happen, but because our ecosystems are so fragile and because climate change is making it a lot worse, we have to almost anticipate and preempt what's going on. And so the ability to get data at scale in different remote parts is very crucial and very necessary for these value chains to make decisions. Um, One of the things that this client explored was diversifying where they're sourcing their cacao from, and perhaps is the quality of the cacao going to be the quality that they expect, right? It's not just enough to say, we can get this crop from this other place. There's different varieties and different species. And so in addition to the tracking the prevalence of disease, there's also a quality control and quality check. So making sure that cacao pods are big enough that they can produce the quality of the crop that they expect, that it's fit for the consumer grade, or the downstream buyers that ultimately that fit their standard. And so we're talking about many different business functions, not just the agronomist or the scientist, but also the procurement team, the sustainability team that needs to track, making sure there's no deforestation. In many ways, we're linking these different business groups together and collecting data that is able to service all three of these, or all four or five of these opportunities through one kind of data collection modality.
Mm-hmm. I kind of want to ask you almost what they do without that kind of technology.
Yeah. Yeah,
And then
I think that's a great point. And I think in technology, we have to ground ourselves in that. What is being done absent of the technology? And so typically in these contexts, you're sending people into fields, or you're either relying on people that are locally there, or you're sending people into the field. So agronomists, researchers, folks who maybe have that scientific level of knowledge and research. But the challenge is that there's not a lot of those people in the regions where you might be growing these crops. And so it's a big logistical labor deployment challenge where you're trying to find a scientist or send somebody into the field. They don't live on the farms, right? So they're just visiting, and they have to do a very dense set of data collection and very concentrated amounts of time. That can make it very challenging, and poses a lot of costs on those programs. Not to mention you have very manual tools, so pen and paper, tape measures, calipers, these devices and that are difficult and to fumble with, and you're doing it on a plant by plant basis, which can take a lot of time. Might not be one area that you're collecting data in might not be representative of another area, even on the same field. So you have to go and do multiple samples across these large areas. All of this is very time consumptive and labor intensive. It takes time away from other things that need to happen operationally in these farms. So a lot of logistical challenges, and then which is, important to ground ourselves in that anything that we implement from a technology side has to be a value add on top of those things.
Mm-hmm. Has to serve, yeah. Um, and so in contrast, your tech is actually, maybe you can pull up some of the slides that you were showing me earlier though to kind of ground that.
Yeah,
Um, but essentially
absolutely.
smartphone
Yeah,
sensor.
we have a suite of tools that we rely on, and hopefully you can see my screen now. Um, like
Yes.
I said, Agerpoint's mission is not just to um, get high quality data out of the field, but balance some of the logistical constraints given our experience working in these spaces as well. So, one of our tools that we use and that we've seen very, very beneficial is smartphones as a way to collect data. And we're by no means just a smartphone-based company, but given that there's a need for very high quality data in the field, also thinking about, what do people have in the regions that they exist. Smartphones have proliferated. I think 87% of people across the world now have smartphones. These devices have become much cheaper to produce, much more cost effective, but also a lot more powerful in the different data types they can capture at the same time. So we're talking photos, video, audio, GPS location, timestamps, notes, customizable forms and fields. All of these things we're bringing to the person that's in the field to, minimize the need for deploying scientists or agronomists, allowing for easy to follow instructions, multimodal data collection, multi-language support to also accommodate the different languages that these folks might speak. We take all that data from those nodes that are kind of in field, and fuse that with other geospatial data layers to provide insights such as the measurements of trees, the detection of diseases, the quantity of crops, and the size of yield that you're going to be expecting from your fields. All that's very necessary for business decision making, but in order to start grappling your problem about, when to harvest or where to deploy labor, or what's the sustainability impacts of these practices, you really need that data in the field, which is why we think the smartphone piece is a really
Mhm.
valuable tool that is accessible and affordable.
And then on top of that, you're deploying drones essentially for UAV.
Yeah, there's a suite of tools as well, in addition to the smartphone that you want to layer on. So, if you think about the different vantage points that you need to collect data from, and the trade-offs at different points. So, smartphones are really great as a augment to the field sampling, where you're able to get more points than you would be in a traditional manual way. But you also need this full field geospatial analysis to understand how those how the trends are changing over time. So we often think of it as an interplay between the ground truth and the geospatial or the aerial imagery layer. It's not just one or the other. You need both in order to have an effective data collection and program management solution. So oftentimes we'll use, satellite imagery or drone imagery to identify patterns across the field and use AI perhaps to analyze what that looks like. I'll show you an example at a later slide here. You can see this is an example of something we might capture with the drone, where we're looking at different boundaries in field areas and trying to identify where there might be common patterns. So in this instance, we're looking at the health of trees and whether or not they're performing in the way that they'd expect using drone imagery. So the color classification represents, green representing healthy, and then pink or red representing maybe a little bit less healthy. This then informs our ability to then more efficiently allocate labor into the fields to do the data collection. So going into this red patch to see why might there be a deviation from the norm on this block 111. So in the absence of technology, you're just taking random samples across this block and hoping that what you're collecting data on is sufficient. But with UAV and satellite imagery, you can take that first pass as a way to understand what's happening at the macro level, and then use a more sophisticated tool to go into the specific points to understand what exactly is happening there.
Nice. And then can you go back actually to the one where you're,
This one?
yeah.
Oh, the one before the first one.
No, the cacao pods and how it
Oh,
looks like. I
absolutely.
just want to show the audience as well what it might look like then.
Yeah. So practically, if you imagine, what's happening on this tree, In this case, you might want to measure, or you might want to count the number of pods on here and determine if this tree is ready to be harvested or not. You can imagine how tedious it is to count every single cacao pod one by one, and how difficult it might be to measure each one of these cacao pods to get a sense of the maturity and the harvest readiness. And this is some of the stuff we were doing with our client in real world contexts, where we're looking at this and saying, okay, how can we improve this process? So, like I said, smartphones have the ability to collect a bunch of photos and videos. And then using our technology, we can fuse that to create a real life digital twin that represents this cacao tree, and then use the machine learning to automate what the person would have done in the field. So as you can see here, we're looking at this cacao pod and this cacao tree, excuse me. And the left-hand side is what the person sees, and the right-hand side is kind of what the computer sees. You can see the different colors that classify the object classes into distinct units. So the canopy versus the trunk versus the fruits. And then once we're able to do this level, then you can actually count and measure the cacao pods and say, how many cacao pods are on here, what is the size of them, and then give some sort of score that evaluates whether this tree is ready to be harvested or not. We use similar things for grapes, for instance. Difficult to quantify the number of grapes on a grapevine. But with machine learning, you can actually say, okay, give me everything that's in red and quantify that volume, which automates the entire process and gives you more accurate analysis than what would have been done traditionally in the field. So this is some of like what the smartphone can do. And so imagine many of these point samples taken across large areas. That gives you a better sense of what's actually happening on your farms and allows you to make those decisions. This is just other footage of what we're doing. Like I said, we work with row crops as well. So you can see our ability to count individual units of row crops. And then in this video also, like I said, I'll show you what the analysis looks like in our cloud platform. So uploading all this data to our platform gives you a sense of what's really happening, where this is the 3D digital twin that we're recreating. And then we're able to actually measure and count on each one of these pods and give you that result in a data table that's usable.
Fantastic. And then a really quick question around, like, with all of those different sources of data, then there's a real question about the granularity of information that you're collecting and just decisions you're making about how they complement each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to the point of the looking at both the ground and the sky, there's trade-offs with both. Like this view, you clearly would not be able to see what's happening in the individual tree level, right? You're looking at the canopy top down. And so if you have the ability to deploy people into the field to get that closer inspection, you're able to create this balance between field analysis and individual plant level rigor that allows you to track patterns over time. Yeah.
Okay, and so for this client, again, you have this incredible solution where you can kind of quantify the number of cacao beans, but there's also what you're doing around disease detection.
Yeah, absolutely. So in disease detection, the challenge is really getting ahead of the disease, right? You want to be able to understand what's happening before the impacts start to spread. And so I guess there's many different indicators that might suggest that there's disease present or not. Oftentimes those are visual indicators, maybe of the plant itself, like the leaves that might have discoloration, or the on the fruit level, there might be discolorations or blemishes or physical markings. Typically, like I said, that requires an expert in the field to do that analysis. I mean, some folks that are maybe more versed in what's happening in their farms might have that sense, but it's challenging to get that information in a consistent way that allows you to track that spread. And so we've designed these kind of workflow tools, and you can see we do stuff with like banana diseases as well. We've designed these workflow tools that allow for easier ways to go into the field to actually collect that data. And so easy to follow surveys that allows for our algorithms and our machines in the back end to do that analysis. So we'll often take images and photos of different aspects of a plant, analyze those images in return, whether there's disease or not, and what type of disease is there, the confidence score of the likelihood of that disease. All of this is predicated on our ability to create machine learning models and use AI, which is a really awesome technology that's becoming more prevalent, but analyzing these image frames to ultimately return the likelihood of disease. And then with the metadata we get, can you track the locations of the disease over a large area? So imagine if these dots represent the severity of disease. You could say the purple area is where the disease is very severe. Maybe we should start to perform treatments or block off this area in a way that prevents the spread to the rest of the block, right? So balancing that in-field data collection to make sure you're almost doing that, like almost that contact tracing of disease, and then monitoring the spread. And this is where fusing other data sets also becomes very valuable. So weather data is very crucial, elevation data to track, maybe the rainfall and or the winds that are blowing. So if you can notice that there's a wind that's blowing from the north to the south, then maybe get ahead of the spread of the disease and track this area a little bit more. So we have the ability to also fuse other data sets that complement just the raw data collection that we're able to get.
Terrific. And then, okay, what's my next question? Then one of the abilities of Agerpoint is also to kind of combine all of this for really interesting reporting down the line around the overall productivity of the land.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of one of the challenges that we see, not just in the agriculture sector, but in any sort of anybody that deals with the land use sector, where by the time you get this data, it's in a tabular Excel view, or it's some PDF report that can feel very disconnected from what's actually happening in the field. And it takes, once again, a lot of trained experts to interpret that data in order to make an insight. So having this geospatial visualization tool, as well as the digital twin that represents physically what's actually happening, not only allows for better storytelling, but allows for more representative analysis. In an ideal world, we have a digital twin of everything. We can map the entire world. Obviously, it's not practical and require a lot of coordination and data. But what we have the ability to do is kind of balance both, right? Looking at trends over time from large areas, and then do that more investigative analysis at an individual point. Measuring physical morphologies, like I said, biomass, disease detection, all of these individual plant level analyses we can aggregate to create much larger views. And so a view like this, you could actually see, like I said, how these point samples are color coded, which allows you to make proper decisions rather than having to do that translation between spreadsheet and operational decision making yourself.
Absolutely. Well, I have so many more questions, and I especially like to ask about challenges, but I think actually we're already getting, celebratory comments and questions for you. So I'm gonna skip pretty quickly ahead to the Q&A, and my last one is really, I think when you spoke in prep for this session, you said something around data is the bridge between intention and impact, which was a really lovely quote, and which I wish I could have prompted you to do, but I didn't know if that was going to come out or not. But so the point at the kind of end of this conversation is that now the client has successfully collected this really rich production-focused data set, but Agerpoint can also leverage this technology to activate multiple overlapping use cases. For example, extending this data to calculate physical biomass for carbon removal or enhancing long-term sustainability reporting in general. Those are some of the points that we wanted to touch on to kind of finish up and open up to some of the other collaborators in here.
Yeah, and I think that really reflects the journey that we see with a lot of our clients and the ways in which we work. Oftentimes, it'll start with one specific opportunity, like disease detection or yield estimation. But the value of technology is, and the ways in which we use it is the scalability of it. And so if you can get multiple data types from the same tool and the same device, that allows us to activate multiple different use cases and solve different problems that different business groups in an organization might have, you essentially are able to spread the cost of that technology across all those business groups. And you also start to connect these these business units in an organization that might not have spoken to each other previously. That's oftentimes where Agerpoint, I think, sometimes plays a role, is bridging the gap between some of these business units that might seem like they're disconnected, but are really looking for the same data. I give a good example of EUDR and some of the requirements there, where the EU has deforestation regulation. They need to track, where deforestation might have occurred in a commodity value chain. But embedded with that, you need to understand how much commodity is coming from which location, and then looking at the satellite imagery to see those specific locations, where there might be deforestation risk. And so that might involve multiple different business units, procurement as well as sustainability. There's a need for underlying data that I think both parties share. And so can we create tools and create solutions that bridge the gaps between and solve multiple use cases, such as, in biomass for carbon stock measurements, you need to measure the physical aspects of the tree, very similar to what a agriculture producer might want to understand about, is this, is this tree pruned properly, or is there too much weight from a fruit on one side or the other, or the other? So similar, I think we're all speaking similar languages about the data types we need. And so the way we've built and constructed our tools is such that allows for these different use cases to be activated at the same time.
Here. Thank you, Nick. That was wonderful. And so now I'm going to open to Q&A. If you don't mind stopping that screen share. For the audience, we're now going to unmute you and go for about 15 minutes here, so that we can also have time for breakout rooms at the very, very end, which you're of course allowed to skip, but we'd love to see you at. And so we already have a few people that have put some things in the chat. Gmo, actually, great to see you. Do you want to voice your question out loud?
Hey, everybody. No, this is really cool. Was just curious about specific applications in trees and reforestation products. I suppose specifically with agroforestry, I think would make most sense based on everything I heard. But anything like pruning or maintenance schedules and leveraging AI for field recommendations or natural capital accounting.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think agroforestry represents, kind of touching on the last point I made about that exact intersection between multiple use cases and multiple organizational needs. So you might be growing a fruit tree where you need to measure the quantity of fruits that are on the tree, but also measure the biomass for carbon stock measurements. And the carbon project that I was working on, that was the exact thing they wanted to do, for sustainability development goals. It's great to say we're growing these fruit trees that allows for the farmers and the local communities to, get benefits and either feed their families or sell that fruit to the market. But for carbon stock measurements, you might also want, you definitely will need physical measurements of the biomass. So the DBH measurements that we're all very familiar with that are necessary to calculate carbon stock. So the idea is with one digital twin, we're able to get both of those at the same time. To your point about pruning, one of the benefits of how we're able to do things is looking at the same object or asset class over many capture instances, whether over a single year or over multiple years. And so can you analyze those branch structures to actually see where things might need to be pruned on an individual tree level, or how, in large areas, some microclimate might be affecting the aspects of the trees or that you might see in the area. So the physical model absolutely allows for a lot of these analyses that otherwise you would not be able to do it retroactively. And we have the ability, like I said, to go back to the same asset class, whether it's a tree or a fruit, and look at that change over time, certainly.
Definitely. We've spent a lot of time sort of building tree accounting systems, but we're looking at the industry to then adopt, leverage products. We work quite a bit with Cecil and others. So would love to chat with you to see how we could incorporate some of your work into ours. Maybe there's like API or SDK level collaborations, but I'll reach out. Thanks for the presentation.
Absolutely.
Lovely. And Gmo, you'll be presenting soon, which I'm really excited about, but you're both on the Slack as well to kind of keep that chat going. Daniel, from Gentian, you have the next question.
page. Nick, that was amazing. Thank you. Really, really interesting. I work with AI and computer vision on the biodiversity and ecology side, and I'm just wondering what metrics you're using for biodiversity.
Yeah, that's always the question, isn't it? What is the metric? Biodiversity is such an interesting space to me, and you're probably more expert than I am, but it really depends on what the specifics of that local ecology, right? What is it that you're measuring might differ depending on the zone that you're in. So it's hard to say there's a uniform measurement. What I will say is the underlying needs of biodiversity really boils down to uh, the ability to asset what's present, right? So looking at a space and saying there's this much of this and this much of that, and then comparing the balance between the two, making sure that invasive species are present or are not present, excuse me, and that the local ecology that needs to flourish is there. And that changes depending on, like I said, the nature of what you're looking at. This is why I think our workflow tools are very valuable. Certainly we can take an image of a scene or a video of a scene and use AI to identify the species that are there, but I think that can be challenging in some areas where you might not have been able to map the biodiversity previously, such as Latin or Central America. So where the workflow tool allows for, the more forms and fields to be distributed at a local level, and then activating citizen science and local communities as a way to help collect that data. But the key is doing it in a way that those local communities can actually use. So multi-language support, like I said, forms and fields that are distributed, and then having the GPS location of every single one of those data collection instances. I think that, to me, is what I think of as a biodiversity survey. So to answer your question directly, there's no standard way to measure biodiversity, but certainly something that we openly invite collaboration on.
Thank you.
Lovely. Jonathan, you're next. Do you want to voice your question out loud?
Sure. Do you think this concept is scalable at more of a cities and urban planning scale? Do any stakeholders like that find value in this, like urban forest monitoring or economic development investment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you think about like parks, for instance, we've got some conversations we have with some governments that are looking to just track the growth of trees, and they're trying to greenify their spaces. So if that's one aspect you're talking about, just being able to kind of do inventories, if anything, is actually much easier in a city landscape where it's easier to navigate in the field. But in terms of urban development, I mean, like I said, it really comes down to what it is you're trying to capture. So curious if there's anything in particular that you're thinking of.
Well, actually, yeah, I do want to connect with you. I met Kevin last year about some large scale planning projects that we're doing kind of all over the place. But we have developers interested in tracking carbon capture, urban heat island effect, comfort, and biodiversity.
Yeah, once again, I think it just comes down to the ability to assetize each individual unit of what you're trying to collect. So for carbon capture for trees, for instance, you really just need where the tree is, what is the species and what is the physical measurements. In an urban context, it's actually, I think, much easier than some of the natural restoration. Like I said, we do a lot of, we're starting to do work with parks, entities that, and governments, municipalities that might want to greenify their spaces, and to do effective park management. Similarly, you have to kind of have an assetization of it, but there's also storytelling element. I think that's really powerful as well. Imagine you go to Central Park and you could see like a digital twin of Central Park and the areas around it. I think that's as much as the data is important, the storytelling is also very valuable in urban contexts.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Nick. All right. Does anyone else want to raise their hand, have a question, a follow-up here? Familiar bit of space. Chris, it seems like you're coming on camera.
Yeah, sorry about that. I did want to find out about how you partner and how people access your tools and technology. What are those points of interaction and opportunity?
Yeah. So the way in which we work, oftentimes the buyer might be a little bit different than the user, where we tend to be a little bit more B2B, where we work with companies and entities that have big data needs or manage land at large scale, and need data from that land. So we typically start with understanding what those needs are, perhaps a technology evaluation to understand how things in the region have been done traditionally and manually, and then applying our technology to do a A/B comparison of if our tools are suitable and how we can design a data collection program in a way that suits their needs. And so once again, the buyer might be a large co-op that needs data about a regenerative agriculture practice, for instance. But the user will be those farmers or those individuals that are closer to the land, that are closer to the field. And so in terms of ways to get started, it's very easy for us to get the tool into folks' hands. We're a technology company, so very SaaS-based approach. But the effectiveness in our tool, I think, really comes from designing a program in a way that solves a real problem, and understanding the needs of the customer. So we tend to prefer working initially with a technology evaluation and then go from there.
Fantastic. Yeah, look forward to making contact, working with a restoration organization, managing a portfolio of projects across Southern Africa. And yeah, it'll be great to connect.
Of course.
Thanks.
Nick, it sounds like you better put your email inside the chat.
I'll do that right now, but I'm sure there'll be opportunities to follow up afterwards.
Absolutely.